So thank you very much for the presentation and for the paper. Our second paper will be presented by Derek Johnson, Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Communication Studies at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. His research examines media industries, looking specifically at how production and creativity operate as a side of cultural struggle across television, contemporary film, digital games, comics, and merchandising. Among his publications, we can find titles such as Media Franchises, Creative License, and Collaboration in the Culture Industries, and co-edited volumes exploring the issues of media authorship and cultures of management in the entertainment industries. Today, Derek is going to talk about the international strategies of US broadcast channels and streaming services.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm not a specialist in European TV, but my hope today is that I can offer some kind of useful perspective on U.S. efforts to operate throughout the globe. So, although the US-based Netflix has made significant inroads in its attempt to become the major global player in television streaming, its efforts to do so have relied upon both agreements with traditional national broadcast services in the US and the disinterest of those partners in seeking out their own global markets, even as they too expand into the streaming market. Examining how U.S. broadcasters like ABC and CBS develop their own original programming to support proprietary domestic digital distribution platforms, even as they license their programs to Netflix as part of its global expansion, I argue today that legacy television services continue to play a major role in the digital transformation of international television markets. Yet quite contradictorily, they do so while operating from their historical identities as national broadcast institutions. To explore these issues, my paper first zeroes in on the efforts of CBS to develop new original programming to attract subscribers to its fledgling all-access streaming service in the US, looking to the license fees that Netflix pays for international distribution rights as a means to fully fund CBS's costs of production and to limit the risk of CBS's expansion into subscription television. Second, I briefly consider Netflix branding of U.S. broadcast network content as original programming as part of its strategy outside the U.S. And finally, I look to the example of Hulu to consider how and why U.S. broadcasters remain nation-centric in their digital ambitions rather than figuring themselves as global competitors with Netflix on the global stage in the same way that they do domestically. Ultimately, I want this talk to contribute to the study of both digital and global television by revealing the ways in which traditional television network and channel models and the national frameworks supporting them continue to shape new global distribution models and programming strategies in online television streaming. So my analysis throughout is informed by work that I've done recently as editor and contributor to the recently published From Networks to Netflix, A Guide to Changing Channels, which considers the continued importance of the television channel as a conceptual framework in the organization of the television industries and our study of it. While it unsurprisingly has a lot to say, the book has a lot to say about the US television industry, the project aimed to be global in its scope, including chapters on television channels both established and emerging in the UK, Denmark, India, Brazil, and China. Suffice it to say, I learned quite a bit from working with my contributors on this project, including my colleague AJ Christian, who contributed a brilliant chapter on development for independent digital television platforms. From those collaborations, we were able to reveal how the legacy logics of television channels persist not only in the branding strategies of contemporary network platforms, but also in the attempt of institutions to carve out and construct spaces of institutional activity. While channels are by no means inevitable or unchanging, they are a fundamental part of how television has been organized as an industry and how distinct territories and market identities are carved out in both collaboration and competition with one another. Far from the channel being an irrelevant relic of the broadcast age, what I hope emerged from the book was a consideration of the continuities between analog and digital television industries against the tendency to look for what's new. As channels become portals, they have changed, but that is an evolution, not an obliteration, of the logics that came before. From flow to streaming, channels continue to deliver, via water metaphors it seems, different currents of television programming in which viewers might be swept away, whether through linear scheduling decisions or the nonlinear binging practices of digital viewers themselves. Channels are sites where the television industry is produced, and I am eager in this presentation to emphasize the ways in which the contours of global television distribution may be shaped by this evolution and the persistence of legacy channel logics within that process. My own contribution to the volume focused on the efforts of CBS to adopt its broadcast channel logics to the space of digital distribution. And here today, I would like to reflect in a way that I didn't have space for in the book on the service's original programming as an extension of an explicitly national channel legacy into the digital market. CBS's new service not only competes with Netflix when considered domestically, but outside of that national channel framework, CBS and Netflix so far have proved to be happy partners. So in the US market, the battle for control of television turns significantly on the control of original content that can support consumer interest in competing subscription services. The US television market has been fundamentally reshaped by what scholars like Amanda Lotz call a disruption, where new subscription-based streaming services have provided their users with portals to vast libraries of television content from which to choose, and in doing so have dislodged traditional network and cable channels from their position of power over the development and curation of programming. Yet the rise of Netflix as the dominant streaming player was also fed by the old guard of the television industry who saw online distribution as a valuable ancillary distribution window that might replace revenues lost to the dwindling broadcast syndication and later DVD markets. The studios that license their content to the major broadcast and cable networks, often within vertically integrated corporate relationship, thus looked to Netflix as a new customer, while many of those networks hoped that, like DVD before it, online distribution might bring added visibility to the series that they continued to program in the linear context. Beneath this arrangement, however, the old and the new each sought to unseat the other. On the one hand, Netflix invested in the production of its own original content, competing with broadcast and cable for perceptions of quality and accolade, but in the process establishing its own supply of product so as not to be at the mercy of studio suppliers. On the other, the old guard of broadcast television developed their own streaming platforms rather than relying exclusively upon Netflix. In 2007, the US networks NBC, ABC, and Fox all joined forces to create the Hulu platform as an alternative to the services controlled by upstart competitors like Netflix and Google. And while the fourth of four major broadcast networks, CBS, elected not to participate in Hulu, it too had created by 2015 its own individually branded subscription service, CBS All Access, which gave users online access to its programming outside or over the top of any relationship to local broadcasters or cable providers. To attract subscribers to a service that they could otherwise access for free over the air, CBS began investing in the production of original content that would be exclusive to its online platform. In 2017, ABC's parent company, Disney, announced its own plans for a proprietary streaming service, which also cast doubt on the strength of its existing relationship with Netflix and suggesting that brands once shared with it, like the highly lucrative Marvel Comics franchise, might be kept exclusively under this corporate umbrella in the future. But while the domestic market in the US might be characterized by these efforts for online services to disentangle themselves from their reliance for content on legacy companies that are seeking to establish their own footholds in streaming, the participation of these companies in the global market looks considerably different. As far as global distribution is concerned, these companies appear, again, at least for now, happy to support the other based on perception of separate market interests. While the domestic divide here once turned on perceptions of analog versus digital distribution markets, in the case of legacy television networks and their digital partner YouTube, the division that allows for global collaboration is a geographically and nationally bounded channel outlook. So the original programming strategies of CBS All Access present a valuable case study. Although production delays resulted in The Good Fight, which was a spin-off of CBS legal drama The Good Wife, actually becoming the first original series exclusively carried by this digital service, early announcements for Star Trek Discovery made clear that the all-access service would rely significantly on the appeal of this established science fiction franchise to draw in its new subscribers. It was, as Les Moonves put it, content to die for. Les Moonves is the CEO of CBS. Many pre-existing fans of the franchise chafed at the idea of paying for access to Star Trek, which had always previously been free, or rather in exchange for viewing ads, as part of the offerings of broadcast television channels in the network and and syndication economies. Yet putting Discovery behind this $5.99 monthly paywall of CBS All Access now encouraged fans to pay for this content. So Discovery was quite baldly the bait to build a new subscriber base and enable CBS to adapt its channel brand to the streaming realm, establishing an exclusive offering to distinguish its digital library from those other digital libraries offered by Netflix, Hulu, and other streaming competitors. During development, Les Moonves remarked that, quote, Star Trek Discovery could have sold anywhere, and yet it was odd to take our content, which is the family jewels, and put it in an organization with our competitors, unquote. Early reports suggested that this gambit was fairly successful. Although CBS, echoing Netflix here and not releasing hard subscription numbers, it claimed that the premiere of Discovery in September 2017 drove a record number of subscriptions for the service and a 64% increase in downloads of the All Access app. However, CBS's efforts to retain its family jewels, as they call it, which is kind of a weird metaphor, to support its digital ambitions extended only so far as the domestic market, revealing the limited national scope of these ambitions. CBS's initial vision for All Access and its hopes to compete with companies like Netflix for consumer subscription dollars extended only as far as the borders of the US until just last month, which I'll get to at the end. So this national scope made a certain amount of sense given the persistence of the relationships between CBS as a national broadcast network and its affiliate stations, whose local sports and news programming are often made available to All Access subscribers. In this way, All Access seeks to transplant to the streaming economy, the nationally organized and regulated institutions and structures of the broadcasting industry. This is not to say that there is no role for global thinking in the CBS All Access strategy. Quite oppositely, in fact, CBS figures global sales as support for its efforts to develop exclusive content for the domestic digital outlook. In Canada, Discovery has been licensed to the Space Channel, included in traditional satellite and cable packages. Outside of North America, however, the digital competitor from which Les Moonves and others seek to retain Discovery actually becomes an ally. While lacking US rights, Netflix paid CBS $80 million for the international rights to Discovery's first season alone, which was also packaged with the 5 older Star Trek series that had preceded it. And with the budget for the first season of this new series patterned at $6 to $7 million per episode, this global distribution partnership with Netflix represented not just a windfall of ancillary international revenue, but a model aimed at mitigating the costs and risks of expansion into the domestic subscription market. CBS could use Discovery as a bargaining chip to break into digital domestically, even if the subscriber base remained painfully small and unsustainable, because it could rely upon Netflix to cover the investment in the global market. So at the same time as CBS actively sought in its domestic outlook to withhold properties like Star Trek from Netflix as exclusive original programming, it also sought partnership with Netflix to collect the global revenues that were outside the legacy broadcaster's national remit. So as Netflix takes programs like Discovery out of their exclusivized context of domestic distribution, it leverages them as part of an effort to become the dominant streaming platform in the world. While domestic US streaming platforms like CBS All Access lack significant international ambitions, Netflix's digital strategy looks explicitly outward to global markets. As Tim Havens argues in his chapter in From Networks to Netflix, Netflix is aiming to be not just a general entertainment service that can appeal to all audiences on the strength of its deep library, but also a globally flexible brand that can develop precise forms of program differentiation in various international markets. In other words, while Netflix is not a channel brand that embraces narrowcasting logics, it nevertheless indigenizes its program offerings in response to varied cultural codes, competitive landscapes, and television viewing practices. Netflix thus has the ambitions of building a giant global subscriber base by not only delivering but also sourcing content from around the world. This means acquiring local programming for its library while representing content that originated in other national contexts as an integrated part of those localized libraries. So while a program like Discovery may be exclusive to CBS All Access in the US, in other markets it can be dubbed a Netflix original, begging the question many of us have certainly asked already about the dubiousness of such designations. This practice is quite commonplace, and in at least one case, Netflix has become so invested in its international originals, acquired from ostensible US competitors, that it has sought to extend production when the domestic network has declined the renewal option. Last month, when ABC canceled the White House drama Designated Survivor, Netflix entered into talks, still unresolved to my knowledge, about supporting the continued production of the series. Although this surely pleased any US fans, Netflix interest extended less from a desire to take over and continue the struggling first-run distribution of the series in the domestic context than its interest to sustain the already proven first-run international viewership on Netflix, for which it surely already had corroborating data for this and many other ABC series that it presents as Netflix originals outside the US. So the US broadcast industry's yielding of the international market makes sense in relationship to their historical practices and emphasis on using global sales to support a domestic agenda. In the pre-digital days of international television syndication, US content rights holders would sell their wares at trade shows on a market-to-market basis. Netflix, on the other hand, is willing to pay handsomely for blanket global rights that it can use across any number of national markets into which it moves. Instead of selling to local television programmers abroad, US broadcasters and studios can sell their content to Netflix to manage its global digital distribution. Of course, partnering with Netflix for global distribution does not mean that legacy US television companies do not have designs on expanding into this market one day as a global competitor to Netflix. But based on these companies' history, it seems unlikely that such ambitions are a target for significant investment. The broadcaster-owned Hulu platform that competes with Netflix domestically in the US, for example, has been organized around a distinctly national character. As Evan Elkins argues in his chapter on Hulu, we would be wrong to assume that the establishment of a streaming video on-demand economy translates into global ubiquity for these services. While Hulu is available outside the US and Japan, that company is actually managed under a different ownership structure, since Hulu sold the platform to Japanese broadcaster Nippon Television in 2014, and that service also draws from a distinct content library. As Elkins argues, digital technology means that delivery has global potential, but companies like Hulu and Hulu Japan represent the persistence of national frameworks and geographic boundaries around television industries. Hulu claims to have long-term goals of operating worldwide, but admits to having no timetable for such expansion, rendering such hopes vague at best and contradicted by the sell-off of Hulu Japan at worst. While Hulu does acquire international programming for its subscribers, Elkins considers this incorporation of incorporation of cosmopolitanism into its nationally specific television structure. So to conclude, in this light, even as US companies like CBS and Disney sought to develop their own proprietary digital platforms beyond the collaborative effort of Hulu, we might expect these national frameworks to persevere. Even when new over-the-top services do develop global ambitions, they cannot simply pivot away without negotiating the lasting effects of the national. Just last month, for example, CBS launched a Canadian version of All Access as part of a new effort to expand internationally. In this sense, CBS is working to take back a piece of the global market, a small piece, we're only going to Canada, from the likes of Netflix and push its brand beyond the national frame. However, in having already granted licenses for shows like Discovery and The Good Fight to other Canadian channels, this version of All Access represents a fundamentally different package from the US version. It's missing key series and seasons and lacking the exclusive content that was meant to distinguish the US service from its terrestrial forebearer, whose over-the-air signals of CBS affiliates are already available in some Canadian homes. This development does suggest that the collaborative global symbiosis shared by US broadcasters and Netflix could one day change. But to do so, they will need to shed the national frameworks that continue to structure U.S. broadcasting, revising the scope and terms with which it makes its future licensing deals. Nations still matter not just as markets, but also as the fields in which industrial ambitions are imagined and in which the competition between channels is understood. Outside of that national scope, domestic competitors can become collaborators. This transnational state of affairs is one that global media industry scholars, including Michelle Hilms, have already recognized. But applied to the question of television streaming services and their programming strategies, this transnational perspective invites us to consider how concepts like exclusivity and originality might be considered in new ways. Just as these services themselves operate within national boundaries, we must consider things like exclusivity and originality to be relative terms equally defined in relation to the national scope of the channels within which industry competition is being envisioned. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the second presentation, and moving to the third. Our third speaker is A.J. Christian, who is assistant professor at Northwestern University at Communication Studies Department. His book Open TV, Innovation Beyond Hollywood and the Rise of Web Television argues that the web brought innovation to television by opening development to independent producers. His work was published in the Cinema Journal, the International Journal of Communication, and he leads a research project called OTV, Open Television, which also serves as a platform for intersectional television. Today he's going to talk about the potential of local capacity-dependent productions for global reach in his paper Scaling Development, Local Value in Global TV Markets.
Thank you all for having me. I'm not usually invited to the Global Media Studies party, so my work is very US-based, but I think we're all grappling with the fact that these things are increasingly and implicitly global. Today I'll be talking about the value of the local in a global context in terms of generating new intellectual property, experimentations with form, and bringing new workers into the system. I'm going to set my timer so I know how much time I have. And actually this isn't presenter view, but that's fine. I can extemporize. So thank you also, Derek, for reminding me about that chapter, because a lot of what I'll be talking about today is in that chapter. So in my book Open TV, I look at how development has expanded due to the internet, arguing that, as you just said, the web open development to independent producers. Some of you may know of some of these case studies. When I was writing this book, I was very influenced by Stuart Cunningham's notion of hidden innovation, because the people I was researching were hidden by Hollywood, and they didn't really know that these people existed. And then while I was writing the book, folks started to get development deals. High Maintenance is a really interesting case study of a husband-wife team who developed the show about a cannabis dealer in New York. Did it indie first, then moved up to Vimeo, who at the time was starting original programming, has since cut that initiative. Then it moved to FX, where it was in development for a little bit before going straight to series at HBO. And HBO does not typically order shows straight to series. I think even Game of Thrones had a pilot before they ordered that series. But High Maintenance had already developed the show online, right? They had already honed the voice, the characters, and the intellectual property on their own without any channels or distributors. Issa Rae did the same thing with her show Awkward Black Girl, which is now Insecure on HBO. Abby Jacobson, Alana Glazer with Broad City, which was at YouTube before Amy Poehler took it to FX, where, again, FX lost it to Comedy Central. And then even The Outs, which was independent on Vimeo, but then moved into the Vimeo original programming slate while they were doing that. So, in the book I track how development has gone from closed and network-driven to potentially open, where shows are developed in collaboration with communities of producers, their fans, who often will supply them funds through crowdfunding, and to a lesser extent by major brand sponsors. Of course, the big caveat here being that in the United States, we need net neutrality for that market to stay open. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. In terms of production, writers and producers have more control over their series. The representations that they create, for me specifically from historically marginalized communities, are more sincere as opposed to being developed to be authentic. My advisor, one of my advisors, John Jackson, has this idea that sincerity is a creation of the object's maker, right? I need to negotiate with you, an audience, interpersonally, how I relate to all these big sociocultural categories like race, gender, sexuality, whereas network executives historically try to confine those representations so they meet some script, right, that we understand as real. So if it's a show about black people, it has to have violence and hip hop, right, which is not every black person's experience. And in terms of distribution, indie distributors were more flexible in the way that they developed programming. They were more likely to give artists their own intellectual property. Distribution agreements were largely non-exclusive as opposed to exclusive. And this was, of course, because they were trying to build credibility with new producers, but I think it also showed me that there was maybe a different way to develop programming. So those are the organizations of the chapter. There's a chapter on production, representation, and distribution in the book. The last chapter is a more complicated story. I talk about the rise of big data TV and the ways in which these networked distributors are replicating a lot of the inequalities and problems of the legacy media era by focusing on big data. And so if you look at these platforms, which, some of which were very open to start, have since shifted towards prepackaged buying, right? So, YouTube essentially outsources most of its short form production in terms of people just making shows and uploading them, right, to the platform. And sometimes multi-channel networks also mediate that process by giving people sponsorship and whatnot. But now that YouTube is in long form, what are they doing? They're doing what almost every other network is doing, including the old legacy media networks, which is going to the major agencies, CAA, WME, UTA, and buying shows that agents package with directors, actors, and scripts already attached. Netflix doesn't have any short form programming. Amazon and does have ways for indies to distribute their own shows through their platform, and some people actually say that that program's pretty good in terms of giving them some revenue share. But generally speaking, those are ancillary businesses to these companies, right? And they're really spending most of their money, upwards of $1 billion. And of course, for Netflix, it seems as in 2017 or 2018, it'll be $8 billion on long-form programming purchased from Hollywood agencies. And this is a problem, I argue, because there might actually be more efficient and democratic ways to develop content that allow folks who aren't on the radar of the agencies to actually get noticed and get their stories out there. And so for my second project, this is talked about in the epilogue of my book, but I'm 3 years into trying to ask the question of how scaling television development might affect our understanding of its value in a global economy. So I develop what would historically be understood as small audiences, though if we understand Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality, these audiences might actually be bigger, right? By representing black women, you're representing black people and women, therefore getting more audience potential. So I'm going to go to the website and just show you a little bit of this while I talk about the development piece. So this is our website, OTV Open Television. If you click on here, you can go and see our shows. We have around 30 projects on the website, half original series right here, and half pilots, music videos, experimental video art, etc. But the trailer is right here on the website. I'm going to play that while I speak so you can see just sort of generally what these shows look like, smell like, taste like. The development process works differently at a smaller scale. Development for most legacy and corporate distributors is a process of buying. They have a piece of intellectual property that is a show delineated by the script, the story, the characters, etc. There's a set number of creators attached to that, and they license that show or buy the intellectual property outright, and that's what development executives do. They're buyers. They give people deals, multi-million-dollar deals, in order to get their shows made, produced, and distributed nationally and sometimes globally as well. On the smaller scale, development's a little bit different, right? I don't have a $10 million check to write anybody, so I assist local artists in Chicago who identify along the margins of 2 or more identities, race, gender, sexuality, class, religion, disability. In financing their shows, I help them write grants, connect them to people who can assist with their crowdfunding campaigns, sometimes investors and sponsors. I help them produce it in terms of giving them access to the resources that we have developed over the years, crew, locations, insurance, and then we distribute those across 5 social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Vimeo, where we also upload the videos, and then many of them also have their own social media platforms, which I advise them to do, because if they're going to be cultivating their own audience, that's a form of value, right, that they can take with them as their careers develop. And we also show everything in the city of Chicago. You're seeing our programs from last year. I do want to make sure I show a little bit of the current programming from 2018, because I'm going to talk about one of them later on. I think that should get me to it. No. I'm not going to be able to find this, but we show everything in Chicago. We do a screening at the Chicago Cultural Center or local museums, both as a way to sort of get a little bit of audience. It's also a survey point for me where I can get a little bit of a sense of our demographics, because the social media networks actually don't give you very good data about your audience. But mostly it's about bringing people together, right, and actually building local capacity for developing television. A lot of collaborations and projects start from these exhibition points. So what is the value of local television? Chicago is a really fascinating case study of what a kind of second-tier city might be able to do. Of course, it's the second city. It's also an incubator city. It's a city that artists go to get their first sort of bit of experience before they move on to New York or LA, which is something I've seen happen many times over the years. This is a financially incentivized production community. There is a state tax credit in the state of Illinois that will refund you up to 1/3 of your production budget if your budget is at least $50,000 to $100,000, whether it's TV, that's the $50,000 level, or film, if you're going to do something that's more than an hour, $100,000. That has brought Hollywood to Chicago, so there is runaway production in Chicago. The city claims to have the largest independent studio outside of Hollywood in North America in CineSpace. There's tens of thousands of square feet of production space that's mostly reserved for the Dick Wolf shows, Chicago Med, Chicago Fire, and Chicago PD. Dick Wolf, obviously, of the Law and Order franchise. Chicago is hoping that Dick Wolf will bring and keep production in Chicago for many decades, as he did with New York and Law and Order. That has also brought crew to the city and has the crew sort of staying in the city, which has helped me enormously. CineSpace opened in 2012 when I got the job at Northwestern, and since then, most of these web series that I'm distributing, I don't actually have to personally produce. Most of what we have on the site, I haven't personally produced, I've assisted. But people are just making great shows in Chicago, and so I've been happy to offer the platform. I think that, you know, Chicago's history of developing artists for Hollywood, specifically in the realms of comedy through Second City, which is a feeder to SNL, Saturday Night Live on NBC, and to theater by developing writers and actors and directors, many of whom have gone on to Hollywood. The names that people might know of would include, like, Tanya Sriracha, who now has an overall deal at Starz. Her show Vida, I think, just premiered on Starz. But there's really so many actors, especially, that have gone through the Chicago theater scene. And in Steppenwolf, if you go on Steppenwolf's website and look at their company members, their faces you recognize from television shows and films. There's a great history of community-based art in Chicago, specifically around writing, spoken word, live literature, but also performance and dance, that brings a collaborative spirit to the city and makes it so that, unlike in New York and LA, which are global centers based on competition, there's actually tremendous impetus for collaboration in the city of Chicago, and that has really allowed these kinds of independent intellectual properties to develop. There's a diverse artistic community in Chicago, not only comedy theater, dance, but there's a vibrant music scene, so there's original music that can be developed in these shows. And I wish I could play this clip. It's from the premiere of our show, Brown Girls. And that sort of show, you can hear the music, it's from a local artist, and so much of the beauty of that show came from that kind of collaboration. And finally, there's a small investor class as well in Chicago. There are people with money, not as much money as in New York or LA, but there are people who are very invested in making sure that intellectual property comes out of Chicago, as opposed to just the ideas coming from the coast being transported to our city. The Chicago Media Angels is the biggest group, and they're right now spending $250,000 funding 5 web series in the city. I was on the committee for that particular grant, but there are a number of other kind of smaller folks. Oh, and of course, the most important thing. The big disadvantage and advantage to being in Chicago is that there are no agencies, like the big agencies that all the big data networks are buying from, CA, MTA, UTA, WME primarily. So that means they have no offices in Chicago. So that's the main impediment to why Chicago series aren't selling. But it also is an advantage because, for me, because I am developing these shows that Hollywood has no idea about, and I'm becoming that kind of agency that's actually feeding content to the major networks. So for camera, you can have your camera on this slide, but when I get to the next slide, I'd like you to cut off because things on the next slide are not yet public. But this is public. So last year, we had a show called Brown Girls that became our hit series. The director of that show, Sam Bailey, had actually did our first show, You're So Talented, and I really helped her build her portfolio with that show. By the time Brown Girls came along by a poet, Fatima Asghar, who wrote this show. This was her very first series. She had been working in Chicago's poetry communities for many years. They really didn't need my help. I just wrote them checks to make this show. The show had an amazing launch, and if you go to my one of my talks at ICA, I think it's the one on Saturday, I'll talk a lot more about how this show launched. But it essentially had a national release with 16 simultaneous screenings in February. It was the #2 trending hashtag on Twitter that night. It, had dozens of articles, including Time Magazine, The Guardian, NBC, BET, everybody covered this show. So when it launched, 2 weeks after the premiere, they were already in Hollywood pitching to 8 networks, including Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Comedy Central, everybody. The show eventually sold to HBO, and then the month after that, it was nominated for an Emmy for short form original programming. There's so much to say about this series, but I think what's emblematic here is the ways in which the community really came together to support the show. Jamila Woods, who's one of the more known R&B stars to come out of Chicago, supplied original music to the series. They shot in Pilsen, the neighborhood that's historically Mexican-American in the city of Chicago, but is now gentrifying, and they got locations for free. They shot in DIY spaces. The show had that kind of gritty realness that Hollywood can't really manufacture. I should say that I don't have my notes with me, so I should say that the point of all of this, right, is sort of in what I think it was Patrick was saying yesterday, that I'm following the actors, right? By developing these shows, I have sort of inside knowledge into how things sell, why things sell outside of Hollywood, built from local context. And the interesting thing about Brown Girls, after I interviewed them with their meetings, which I was not in, they said that nobody asked how many views the show had, and we don't make our views public, kind of like Netflix. And it was interesting to me because the show actually has a lot of views, and I was giving them all of their data as they were in these meetings. But it seemed as though the artistry of the show and the fact that it had been covered by press was enough to convince HBO that it would be a valuable intellectual property for them to buy. There have been a number of other development deals that haven't been as big. The team behind our comedy Starving Artists, which is a kind of satire of racial relations in America, received a development deal from Red Hour Entertainment that was secured at the New York Television Festival, which just today announced their entries, and we have 2 more shows in this year's festival. Please make sure you don't record this part. that when you go to NYTVF, you can get meetings with a number of networks. They have network partners that allow them to source new talent and programming. These shows are still negotiating their development deals and still developing. Brujos also was a big show for us in 2017. This is a show about gay Latino witches caught in a supernatural struggle with the descendants of New World colonizers. It's from an NYU PhD student, Ricardo Gamboa, who is from Chicago. We are currently negotiating a licensing offer from the El Rey Network, which is a Latino-Latina cable network in the United States that really needs this kind of sort of, I think they would view it as edgy programming. There's violence and sex, it's very queer. There's also lectures on neoliberalism and the police state because they're PhD students. So we'll see if that happens, but I think that show will sell because it's just so unique and there's so little Latina programming in Hollywood right now. Our show, The Tea, is currently raising money and releasing their first season in June. I was able to, from a $4,000 pilot concept, get them a $70,000 distribution offer from a company called Black Pills, which is based in Paris, but has offices in LA. That offer actually fell through because negotiations took too long and they said they had to get reapproval from their board and it was denied, which makes me concerned about Black Pills' financial stability because they are supposed to be doing million-dollar co-productions. But nevertheless, The Tea is also the City of Chicago's Filmmakers in Residence project, and so they got $10,000 from the city, and that enabled them to shoot the show. There's so few series about trans people, by and about trans people, that I think this one has the high potential to spread, and if Ryan Murphy's show starring trans people does well next month, it could initiate a buy from a major network. And then finally, this project isn't just about filtering content to major corporations that are global distributors of content. We actually have a licensing deal from a university team for this show called Good Enough, which shot in April. This is a series from Elijah McKinnon, who on the right there, yes, on the right, is my head of marketing, also did the brand and all the logo stuff for OTV. The show is about queer people of color living in a co-op and negotiating sexual health. Duke University and the University of North Carolina are developing an app called P3. It is designed to help people take pills, so it gives you sort of reminders to take your pills. They're piloting it with Black and queer youth for a drug called PrEP, which if you take every day prevents you from contracting HIV. So they're using this as a way to encourage youth to use the app and take their pills. And as they use the app and gain more points, they unlock episodes of this series that is about Black queer people, right? So there's ways in which we can think about the local production is actually also serving social good, public good, as well as economic value. There's been a number of new developments which I probably don't have time to get into because I have 1 minute. We're not the only indie channel. Most of the other indie channels in this market are SVODs because they need money. We're a university and nonprofit funded. There's corporate incubators that are doing this kind of work as well, and I also talk to them, companies like New Forum Digital and Portal A that are trying to, that's my 20 minutes, trying to develop intellectual property in a different way than MCNs, right, which are very big data driven. They only work with people who have big audiences, but in fact what Holly has realized is that just because you have 1 million subscribers on YouTube doesn't mean that you can make a hit show, right? Like, you actually need to be able to write a story well. So I think we were ahead of the curve on this. Jeffrey Katzenberg just raised almost $1 billion to do a similar kind of thing, blockbuster short form. There's investor interest. I can talk about that in the Q&A. And there's new writer-driven studio deals that Netflix is piloting that I think could be, a lot of these people, as they look for content, might be looking towards local developers for new stories. And there's lots of bigger questions that this project can allow me to answer going forward in terms of understanding what's production value, what is exhibition value, what kinds of qualitative and quantitative data can we get about audiences, and what works online. I have an article about representational value already in IJOC about how by doing development as research, it helps us to understand the value of representations in a global networked economy. And of course, I talked about development value today. Thank you very much.
Our final presenter is Petr Štěpánek from Charles University here in Prague, and I think there is no need to introduce the program chair of the conference, and we have also seen some of his latest work being quoted yesterday. Petr wrote several books on the history of Czech film industry. He co-edited the volume Behind the Screen, Inside European Production Culture, and he also was the leader of an European Union-funded FINE project, which used student internships for a collective ethnography of production cultures. In 2015, he was the main author of an industry report on practices of screenplay development for the Czech State Film Fund. And today he is going to talk about short-form web TV programming as a challenge to public service media.
So thank you, Sharka, for the introduction. I was actually inspired pretty much by Aymar Jean-Christian's work on independent web series, which sensitized me to see the potential of the short-form original programming, internet-only programming, and also see what's missing in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. So this is the topic of my talk today. I realized that short-form web series are actually symptomatic of and very much embedded in the local and regional screen industry ecosystems by being actually stuck in the middle between TV and film industries on one hand, social media on the other, and also being conditioned by the development of online advertisement markets. So these are like three strong conditions which are limiting and also driving the web series production in Czech Republic and elsewhere in the region. Some of the data which I will use are borrowed from a thesis of my graduate student Dorota Vašičková, who is also sitting here, and also from a team of our grant-based project CREAS, which collected some data on other European countries' original web series production. When you look at what's happening in Western and Northern Europe, you will see that public service broadcasters, and this is my main perspective, public service mission, public service values, public service broadcasters are actually or have been producing original web series since around 2010, 2012, sometimes 2007, like in Scandinavia. And in the last 5 years, they are launching special programs, production programs, subsidy programs, special portals like these ones, to support, fund, develop, commission original internet-only, online-only programming. Of course, you have heard about iPlayer of BBC, but you might not heard about Web Création from the French-speaking Belgic public service broadcaster RTBF. Probably the biggest one is Funk. Funk is a web television of German public service broadcasters, the two major ARD and ZDF, the two major two major public service televisions in Germany. It's producing currently about 60 programs simultaneously, so it's a large one with a budget over 40 million euros annually. Probably the largest budget out of all these for going to original, or most of it going to original programming. SVT, Arena of ILE in Finland, NRK are all Scandinavian web portals of public service broadcasters in Scandinavia. And of course, French public service television has its own portal, its own web series production program as well. So Western and Northern Europe, Western and Northern European public service broadcasters are actually shifting to producing original internet-only or online-only programming to cater to the audiences which they are otherwise missing. Children, young adults, especially let's say 15 to 24, 15 to 29. This is the core target audience of most of these programs. And if you look at the best known titles, the one is the most prominent among them, and that's Scam or Shame in English of the Norwegian public service broadcaster NRK, which is a web series, 4-season web series on the daily lives of Oslo teenagers, 16 years old girls from one specific high school. It was a huge hit in the whole Scandinavia, especially since the third season. It also traveled globally across the world, and it is being produced in a number of versions in Europe and also in the US. So we will have, or we already have, Italian, Spanish, German, American versions of Scam, and it's really an amazing example of how the producers and the public service broadcaster managed to link the entertainment value of the web series with the public service value. So each of the series is educating, enlightening viewers about specific social, political issues like racial, religion, sexual identities, inequalities, things like that, core topics to the public service mission everywhere. So this is what's happening in Western and Northern Europe. Internet-only programming being sort of a key element in how the public service broadcasters are thinking about reinventing and also legitimizing themselves vis-a-vis social media and the changing habits of their audiences, especially the teenagers and young adults who are actually mostly ignoring the linear television at all. And you can see that it's linked very much to several of the core values of public service media rather than public service broadcasting, like universality. You need to address all the age groups if you want to keep this core value as defined by EBU. Diversity, it's actually the web series are very much actually has a lot of potential to represent different kinds of minorities, minority identities, but also to give a chance, opportunities to minority creators in terms of aesthetics, social, ethnic, and other backgrounds. Innovation, experimenting with new technologies, cultural forms, innovative techniques of transmedia storytelling, and so on. And the short form is a key to understand it, because it's not just about being short, it's more about being flexible. If you watch Scam, it doesn't have a standard length, the individual episodes. It can change according to how the story develops. It can be half an hour, it can be 45 minutes, it can be 20 minutes, 10 minutes. And of course, double storytelling, that's what people like Evan over Bredwald defined in terms in relation to the boom of Scandinavian TV series, how it's able to connect the entertainment value with the educational enlightenment value of its stories. It's also about business strategy of the public service broadcasters. It's actually about securing the future license payers, the next generation of license payers, without compromising the core public values. So it's about catering to these viewers who are actually cutting cords, who are stopping watching the linear television, but without losing the core public values of public service media. But it's always about tricky negotiating with the corporate partners. Most of these web series were watched on YouTube, even on Facebook and on other platforms, not on the original portals. That's, for example, the case of Germany, of Funk. So a lot of criticism came, of course, that these public service media are actually using public money to feed corporate, platforms, and to actually they are giving them value for free to monetize, selling out. That's one of the problems. Now, what about Eastern Europe? That's a totally different story. You don't have public service broadcasters producing original short-form programming, internet-only programming. They have their own catch-up portals, of course. They are distributing their own linear TV programs online, but they don't develop, produce, distribute original online-only programming. What's happening instead is that some corporate or independent productions and companies are developing web series which have some elements which actually keep some elements of public service value, typical for public service media. So there is a new challenge to public service media because the corporate private companies are actually producing what is missing in the public service media, especially these two examples, the political satire, the Blaník Bureau from the Czech internet television stream, and the Polish equivalent to the Bureau Blaník, the Chairman's Ear, produced by first independently, but then bought and backed by Showmax, a very interesting VOD platform, which is actually South African based and serving African market, but also expanded to Europe. So it backed Chairman's Ear, but then it was sold to another private television company later on. Both of them are extremely important in the Czech and Polish markets and societies because they are actually cultivating daring political satire reflecting on the ongoing political scandals, affairs, corruption, on the corruption between the business and politics and so on sort of real-time regime, reflecting very quickly, almost immediately, on what's happening in the national politics. Something which is totally missing from the public service broadcasting, both in the Czech Republic and Poland. So it's actually there's an opportunity for us to think about how public service or public values can be cultivated outside the designated space of public service media proper. These are the companies responsible for the web series, the two of them that were on the screen, Showmax in Poland, Stream.cz in the Czech Republic, and here are some examples of their competitors, both in Polish and Czech market. You see the American company Comedy Central and its branch in Poland, and this is a media company, media house in the Czech Republic, which also produces its own web series, competing with Stream.cz. So on the one hand, you have Western Northern Europe, where you have specific subsidy programs, portals, web series produced by the public service broadcasters. And on the other hand, you have East Central Europe, where these kind of programs are totally missing, but there are some examples of web series with public service value outside the designated spaces of public service institutions. Both AVOD like stream.cz or SVOD like Showmax in Poland. So now, what's so unique about this stream.cz company, which was able to produce this, very strong, very popular web series, The Bureau Blanik, which is in its fifth season, and actually was able to build the brand of stream.cz or support the brand in an unprecedented way. Surprisingly, the company is more than 10 years old. And surprisingly, even more, it produced a quite similar kind of web series already in 2007, which was a parody of a soap opera popular at the time in the Czech linear television. It was funded by an ex-private TV network executive, and then bought first half of it in 2007 and then 100% of it in 2011 by the biggest search engine and media platform in the Czech Republic, seznam.cz. So that's its parent company now. So why it took another 7 years before the Bureau Blanik, became such a hit and changed the whole ecosystem of online video production in Czech Republic. So my guess is that it was first the internet advertising market, where online video became more and more important over the years, multiplied by 4 or 5 between 2008 and 2015, and the investment going into online video and into actually internet advertising as such actually surpassed investment into television advertisement in 2015 globally and also in the Czech Republic. So that was one key driver. And then also the position of seznam.cz as the strongest competitor of Google locally, but also in Europe as such. Seznam.cz is actually the only company competing with Google in a national market in Europe, and one of the few competitors of Google on any national market globally. It has about 30% share. Of course, it's not stronger than Google anymore in search, in full text search and in other parameters, but it still has a very significant share, unlike other companies in Europe, which where Google has over 90% share usually. This is how stream.cz transformed. It's typical for many platforms that are transforming their business models, their key products over years, or even more quickly over months. So it was kind of local YouTube or Meta Cafe at the time, and then gradually transforming into a full-fledged internet television or an internet television studio producing around about 40 programs simultaneously, divided into entertainment, fiction web series, and children programs, sort of 3 content types. You can see some of them here. These are some of the biggest hits in the fiction web series content type, and this is the question I asked about how and why stream.cz was able to develop this strong public service mission outside the designated space of public service media. We did a lot of interviews with all of the key executives, producers, but also some of the independent filmmakers working for Stream. They were collaborating with the with the most established film independent company, actually, Negative, which was a surprising combination. We have like the art house independent company on the one hand, and this internet giant with its internet television on the other, teaming up and producing the most successful web series in Eastern Europe. That's a sort of surprising combination, very different from what's happening in this 20-year history of independent web series in the US. when I asked them about their core values, about what Timothy Havens calls industrial lore, how they choose projects, greenlight projects, distinguish between values of their projects, they used terms like clever, informative, topical, socially relevant, socially responsible, authentic, and most prominently eye-opening. So I thought, okay, it sounds like a public service mission very much. But when we dug deeper, there were curious and significant differences between the traditional public service values and this version of public service, presented by the internet television. It was not so much about national politics, about big topics, about professional hosts, anchors. It was more about the eye-opening effects, as they called it, related to very practical everyday issues like fighting the low-quality food products, for example. So that's their flagship. That was their flagship program. When I asked them what was the key program you would mention bearing this kind of values you just described, they said it's not Bureau Blanik, the famous political satire. It's this program about low-quality food. They ordered an expensive scientific tests and so on. About presenters, they said they don't need, well-trained professional presenters. They rather choose more authentic figures who are experts in specific fields, like let's say history or science or popular music, and they let them speak as they are used to speak without special training, because that's a concept of authenticity they are focusing on. So producing public service value outside public service media is possible, I think, but there are some dangers to it. On the one hand, you can have a group of executive producers and filmmakers developing programs which seem like they should be in the public service media, but the public service media were not able actually to develop this kind of projects. They actually rejected some of the pitches, didn't recognize their value, their potential value. On the other hand, it's still a corporate house, and actually later in the end of the last year, the whole management of Stream.cz changed, and they left the company. So this leaves us wondering whether the new management coming from a competitor internet television will be able to keep this agenda for a longer term. So we can't forget that it's not just about a corporate house, because a corporate house has its own agenda. It's maybe more about what Georgina Born calls the situated ethics and situated aesthetics, which develops in specific networks, informal networks of production communities, and they are the bearers of the stability, probably more significantly than the corporation as such. And this is my last remark. So why political satire is such an important genre for developing public service value outside the designated space of public service media in the web series production? Probably because it has such a long history in terms of creating alternative public space in the totalitarian, authoritarian regimes since the Nazi and Stalinist era. Humor, comedy as very strongly social genre, and political satire were actually historically embedded, or have been historically embedded in all these societies in Eastern Europe, and now it's a new manifestation of this. So thank you very much.
So let me thank you as first to all the presenters for their fascinating talks. Before moving to the discussion, I would kindly ask Ira Wagman to sum up the main topics that appeared in all of the papers and ask the first questions.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you to everybody for some excellent papers, and kudos to the organizers of this conference for grouping up these presentations so nicely. So just a couple of remarks as I attempt to try and synthesize some of the things that were said here. This is a panel taking up the question of online television, which is a reminder, of course, for us to consider the incredible range of diversity of genres and forms that exist when we talk about streaming television. One can sometimes can default to a reflex of thinking about streaming as television shows or movies, and the rich part about of this particular panel is that it reminds us of that incredible diversity. But what it also does is it reminds us about the rich diversity of online television, both in terms of its forms, but also in terms of its platforms, the places where these things are distributed and seen. And in the course of these presentations, what we saw is a range of different interrelationships between large media companies and small ones, between major players operating on a global scene and local players or regional ones, and of course the incredible intersections between the two going on, dynamics between open and closed media systems, in between industrial sectors. But one of the things that really comes across in these presentations, and I'm kind of organizing my remarks around those, refers to one of the key concepts, which is in that incredibly long project title that this conference is engaging with, and that is ideas about creativity and adaptability. And I think this is something that really struck me in all of these, in so many of these talks, and with that, notions like cooperation, experimentation, are things that really came across. So in considering each of these four panels, which I'll say like a few brief words, I just organized my remarks around one particular idea, which is kind of a subset of these themes of creativity. Of course, there's lots of overlap here, but anyways, for convenience's sake. In Alexandra's presentation, the concept that I was thinking a lot about was discovery, and the idea of both of incredible changes in film production within Serbia, a range of new opportunities, new institutions, new initiatives. But also in the case of Ireland, of course, the discovery of of that particular part of the country, of ideas about nostalgia, but also, of course, discovery about the potentials and promises of interactive programming. And so this is something that and of course, it reminded me about the fact that. Discovery is I think is a really powerful concept, I think, to think through here, both in terms of I guess in the industrial sense about discoverability, the ways in which platforms or algorithms or those sorts of things make shows discoverable, but also the ways in which so many, particularly web series, but not expressly so, the ways in which they encourage discovery of aspects of life that have not been properly documented, or places or activities or things which haven't been covered before. So I really appreciated that aspect in your talk, Alexandra. In Derek's talk, of course, as you can see, it's not particularly original here, but I'm sorry, Derek. But the idea of collaboration, I think, is one that's really the main theme that comes up in Derek's talk. But there is a really powerful, I think, theoretical idea at the heart of Derek's talk, which is advocacy for us to continue thinking about the value of channels as a way of organizing, as a way of organizing a delivery of a kind of television, as an imagination of an identity for a media broadcaster. Of course, channels still exist, of course, on different kinds of platforms. as a way of thinking about the relationship between legacy media and new players. But also, I think, to question my reaction to Derek's talk was to immediately question the sort of the disruptive rhetoric that we hear a lot about, and to say, like, well, of course, these traditional partners are very much part of that story. So I really appreciated that particular part in your talk, Derek. So for Derek, I think we can see ideas about collaboration as part of the creative ways in which these platforms, CBS, kind of work both nationally and globally. In AJ's talk, of course, the big theme, and something I really think doesn't get enough serious consideration, although it's come up a couple times here yesterday, is development. And the idea in the talk about trying to think about the value of development, and I really this comes out in the OTV example and in ideas about open development, and a reminder again in some of the examples that you're presenting here at the beginning of the talk, examples of high maintenance and use array, about kind of processes of development, which of course encourages me to think about the ways in which we theorize careers in these industries, and to think about what is a career and what is the nature of a career, and to think about the different kinds of pathways that go through, and again how one develops, not just in the sense of in the industrial way, moving from one platform to the other, or one platform being a testing ground for something else, but how that results in certain kinds of artistic development and celebrity development in terms of part of their, but also in AJ's talk, of course, there's the influence of scale on development, and the very powerful argument about the ways in which smaller scale, or working in contexts that maybe lack lots of distributors or lots of agents, creates this kind of opportunity and this dynamism to do some things that couldn't be done before in the case of intersectional television programming. So development is the big theme to me there. Of course, lots of overlap. And Peter, in Peter's talk, which I also very much appreciated, to me, I think we have ideas about negotiation. Negotiation seemed like such an interesting term there in terms of thinking about the ways in which public service broadcasters in Europe, in the first part of the talk, are dealing with web content programs, and this idea of linking entertainment with public service objectives, and the ways in which different public service broadcasters have to negotiate that relationship, working within their mandates, the pressures that come from governments to make them more relevant, and so on. And I did not know, of course, about the fact that there was little involvement within Central and Eastern Europe in this idea. But the idea that private organizations are kind of picking up the slack, of course, results in an argument which says that in these contexts, what we see are different kinds of public service, right? Different takes on public service. And I think, of course, as you gestured to at the end of your talk there, I think in some ways this is something which is happening in lots of different contexts. But of course, I think this is in some ways very much a regional story because of the particular relationships that audiences have had with public service media here in the 20th century, that's for sure. So those sorts of themes come across, and so I'm left with just a couple of little questions, and of course open up for discussion. One would be to ask the panelists, or for us to consider how we think about YouTube. Because I think, again, a lot of the talk has come up about Netflix, and a lot of talk comes up about Facebook, but it really seems like YouTube to me is something which I think is still really very much underthought, and I think it's such a powerful feature, not just as a promotional medium and not just as a developmental medium, but as something else. I can't quite put my words on it, but I wonder if some of the creative and adaptive or adaptational language that I'm using here might be useful for thinking about YouTube in that way. And this is related to the second thing, and then I'll be quiet, or sorry, one more thing, which is maybe we need to talk a little bit more about demographics and audiences. So much of the developmental work that's coming up here is about young people trying new things, experimenting with new models, making new television, providing new content, so on and so forth. And I think demographics is something to say. And the third thing, which I'll be quiet about, which is one thing that we haven't talked about, I think, up to this point, which I think plays such an important role in the development of these industries and is central to the online television stuff, is about hardware, which is about, in Canada, one of the reasons why Netflix is so important is because smart televisions that were embedded with Netflix apps were ubiquitous too. And so questions about, about hardware, the circulation of computers, the penetration of things like cell phones, smart TVs, gaming systems, those sorts of things I think are really important. Net neutrality is the issue about is equally as important, but I think in much of our discussion here, in much of our discussion that we've seen over the last little while, there's been lots of discussion about production, some nice interventions about distribution, but on the consumption end, practical questions about audience breakdowns or demographics, and practical questions, which is the devices on, the character of the devices on which they consume, I think, are worth considering. So, thank you for everyone for such an evocative talks. Yeah.
So we have some 10 minutes for the discussion. So. There are any questions from the audiences? Oh yeah, already.
Hi. Really interesting stuff. So I focus more on music typically than on screen cultures and video. And there's for a long time, I think, in the digital realm as well as in the analog days, been this kind of trend of music being this canary in the coal mine or the low-hanging fruit. And seeing developments in the kind of interrelationship between technology, industry, and culture and music echoing through other forms. So one of the things that's been happening in music in the last few years, and I wonder whether you think it will emerge in some way within these ecologies that you're talking about, is the kind of intersection of the big data that Amar was talking about, algorithmic and automated production, and economies of microscale. So let me give you an example of how that works in music. So Spotify, which I don't need to describe to any of you, at this point about probably between a fifth and a tenth of all of the plays on its branded and genre-specific playlists. For instance, if you listen to, jazzy beats or something like that, they're not songs that are actually produced by independent artists and then licensed through some kind of organization and rolled up into the aggregator. They are produced as work for hires by the aggregator itself, by Spotify itself, in order to both create generic playlists that create segmented and micro-segmented audiences, and in order to defray production costs by not having any licenses or royalties associated with the work, but having it actually be owned in-house. And they keep it at a low enough level that consumers are generally unaware that it's happening at all. To go one step further, something that I've been very interested in and that I've had confirmed in interviews I've done with A&R executives at major labels is that the music industry is beginning to think about purely automated or algorithmically generated content becoming its bread and butter in the not so distant future, right? So, you could almost think of Spotify paying a producer to create a jazzy beat, $500 or $1,000 or whatever, and never having to pay them a royalty as an intermediary step to Spotify just kind of rolling the algorithmic dice and maybe have one curator say, well, this sounds like something a person might make some sense of, and then throwing it on their playlists just in order to generate cost-free content. So what I'm asking you guys is, do you see, I recognize that the economies of production are very different. I recognize that the expectations of audiences are very different. But do you see this particular trend in music playing a role in the kind of creativity and adaptivity of online screen cultures?
Thanks. It's really interesting. So I think, I think the shift towards cost plus distribution is a form of that kind of not having to pay the royalty thing that, Netflix is doing this. And when I was pulled into a meeting with the CEO of Bad Robot a couple of weeks ago, I was telling you that like he's saying that for big production companies, it used to be that you debt finance TV to make more money on the back end, and now it's just like pay me for profit and I'll just make what you want and be done with it, and I never have to go into debt. But I think the challenge with television is that video is a complicated storytelling medium, and algorithmically generating those stories is highly problematic, especially for an ad-supported business, right? So YouTube is now going through this where they have so much programming that the stuff that's offensive is getting ad buys, and their advertisers are mad, so they have to continually restrict access to advertising, right? Because they need to guarantee that the producer actually creates quality programming that's not extreme on either end. And Facebook is going through this as well. There's, hiring 10,000 people to audit programming to make sure that the algorithms don't serve, the wrong ad on the wrong type of thing. So I don't know if that's scalable for television. It's expensive to make video, and it would be a tricky proposition for a network to automate the production aspect. Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm sure you all saw this about maybe 6 months ago, an academic whose name I don't remember, published, I think it was like a Medium post about algorithmically generated YouTube children's videos, like all the weird variations of five finger, you know what I'm talking about? So it struck me that might be an early foray into so
I think it could happen.
It wouldn't necessarily look for the high concepts, high quality kinds of productions, to kind of, maybe in a way the least sophisticated, most vulnerable online populations might be the ones who are receiving this first.
Maybe, yeah.
So there's another question, or if anybody else would like to answer this.
I was just going to add, I agree with AJ that I can't imagine like an entire, short form or long form television story being algorithmically generated, at least at this point, without human intervention to create it. But Netflix is able to analyze its data to sort of, come up with analyses like, okay, this is the point at which people start binge watching these series, right? Like, so, they are able to, at a broader level, sort of say, here are the patterns, right? Here's where we can hook people by using these particular narrative strategies, this kind of a cliffhanger, or these kinds of guest stars are particularly, these people get people to keep watching, these people don't, So, there are ways in which, if not full automation, the creative process can certainly be shaped by that data.
So there is another question coming from the audience.
Hello, Henry Laser from Baltic Film Media School in Tallinn. I have a question for Monsieur Johnson. We've seen the meteor rise of Netflix worldwide, this worldwide business model. My question is, what happened to HBO? HBO's had a worldwide model for 20 years, and they're on all these cable systems around the world. They produce local programming. They adapt programming to local cultures, languages, and things. What did they miss, or how are they different than Netflix? How did Netflix just show up and blow right by them?
I'm not sure that Netflix has blown right by them. I don't have the numbers. I can't compare their global market penetrations at the moment. But I think you're right. HBO has been there and doing this, and they've been globally embedded in a number of different international markets in many different ways, as you say, for some time. And they're certainly in the streaming market. They're out there. I think we saw some charts about this yesterday, looking at different countries throughout Europe, right, where HBO Go is certainly competing with Netflix on that global scale. So I don't think they're down and out or anything like that. And they were left out of my papers because I think I was interested in U.S. broadcasters, right? HBO isn't a broadcaster. They're sort of in this middle space as a premium cable channel. They were already in the subscription economy, right? So I mean, in some ways it's HBO, again, as you say, like, you know, they've been doing these things not just in terms of global expansion, but in terms of the subscription premium economy, right? That Netflix is kind of showing up and saying, oh, we can do this too, right? In a lot of ways, HBO is a model for Netflix to emulate, you know. And so I was a little bit more concerned. Well, what are the broadcasters who are very left behind by HBO and Netflix, right? Like, how are they still kind of positioning themselves or not in these global markets? But I mean, I think HBO is still very much you know, a key part of this global economy.
Yes, there's another question in the back.
Hi, I'm Gillian Doyle from Glasgow. It was really interesting to hear about the many examples in the presentations about new voices, that online distribution has given access to a whole lot of new and experimental voices in terms of video content making. But we live in an era where the mainstream subscription video on demand services, your Amazons and Netflixes, and mainstream paid television are all very keen. They're all vying for edgy content. They all want it. So I guess my question is whether, you know, you think there are any conflicts between, and perhaps particularly for AJ here, whether there are conflicts between securing popular and profitable platforms for new emerging scriptwriters and producers versus, you know, sustaining the unconventional taboo-busting tone of what it is that they're trying to do. Is there a tension there?
Yeah, there's a ton of tensions, actually. I'll name two primarily. So there's the tension of creating sustainable alternatives to distribution, right, which is the key problem. Distribution just requires a lot of capital. And right now, the indie Netflixes that exist in the US, at least, you know, they have several thousands of subscribers paying a few dollars a month. It's enough to get them, you know, a couple new shows a year, but nowhere near on the scale of any of the major big data players. So that's the main issue there. And it's actually interesting. I've been thinking about music and the rise of indie labels in the music economy and the ways in which indie labels are actually not necessarily even privileging online distribution so much as they're privileging like live experiences, right? Put your things online so everybody knows about it, but we're gonna make money off of like merchandise and like ticket sales and that sort of thing. And that's why we screen in Chicago, right? So we have added value. Netflix isn't doing screenings in Chicago. Once you sort of try to bring those new voices in, there's an incredible competition for that intellectual property. And as far as I can tell from my meetings with both the networks and major producers, if you're a new voice and you don't have credits in the system, your ability to command a majority share of that intellectual property is very, very difficult. They have to sort of bring in a J.J. Abrams and Ava DuVernay, Amy Poehler, that can executive produce the show. And if that executive producer is generous, they'll let you tell the story as you want and be staffed on the show or maybe even run the show. But depending on what the network wants, they might also have that executive producer change the story so it's more in their voice and their brand, right? And then, so now you've sold your story that's so personal, and J.J. Abrams is like, actually, I wanted to make it about this. And NBC's like, well, is it JJ or you? Well, JJ has done all this stuff, and what have you done? You know, so there's tensions both in terms of bringing people into the system and existing with outside the system.
Well, one question for Peter. I would be very interested if you could say just a couple of sentences about ownership and financing of these channels.
Yes, so this is fully financed by the company. The Seznam, the internet search engine, and the stream.cz as the internet television, they fully own the rights. It's integrated. Actually, they produce and distribute. And they have fixed budgets, which are low, of course, comparing to the linear television, but they are somehow acceptable for professional filmmakers coming from film and television. You know, at least temporarily, maybe not in a long term, but at least temporarily. And it's AVOD, so about 85%, as far as I know, of the revenues is coming from pre-rolls and mid-rolls in the videos, and the rest is coming from product placement and some kinds of different kinds of partnerships with investors and sponsors. So that's the business model they used. And what is profitable is actually the whole portfolio of the 40 programs. So not necessarily the individual programs. That's why they can be more daring. You know, so they could produce slightly higher budget fiction web series like the Blaník Bureau without necessarily having it profitable. But the whole portfolio with all the YouTuber-based, you know, sort of tabloid clickbait programs they have there as well. So this kind of symbiosis between these two, the whole portfolio is sort of profitable since around 2011, as far as I know. So that's how it works, kind of studio kind of portfolio. Yeah.
Sorry to ask a second question. This is more directed at Alex and Petter. You know, you mentioned a number of forms of youth content that have done really well through online distribution. And just as an open question, I mean, many of these are produced in minority languages, Scam, Norwegian, etc. The question is, you know, what is the success of these services? What is that doing to our understanding of, you know, dominant flows in cultural products? And the idea of cultural discounts and the predominance of majority language material, the understanding that we've had to date. Do you think that there's a challenge here for existing understanding?
Thank you for the question. We just realized that AJ was in the jury when Just Saying won the Satellite Award. And the majority of the content was suggested by you, and Serbian series took the prize. So that's interesting. Let's say that in Balkans there are interest in short form content. It's done by private initiative. People are not so much interested in watching anything. You know, not even YouTube videos. Netflix announced last year that they are, you know, now available in Balkans. Not so many people subscribed. So maybe your question is what we are really interested in. I don't have an answer. It's an open answer to it. But I know that many young people are interested in making stuff, anything. And Film Center Serbia is now providing them means to make films. So between short form and first feature film, you will choose first feature film. So from 2010 till now, we have like 20 young authors with first films and now doing second. And there are not so many interested in making short form content because they have opportunity because of media program and Euromage to make their first features.
So I see the short-form programming as having the advantage of being local in a very strong sense. Scam was extremely local because it was based on kind of ethnographic research done among the high school students, interviews, observation, and so on. Then it traveled abroad, which was a surprise even for the creators and for the network. They didn't expect it at all. So it was kind of total surprise that it traveled first to Denmark and Sweden and then it traveled globally. But most of these web series I watched, I mean European web series, are extremely local and based on like localized deep knowledge of the you know, social groups they are representing. But also very narrow in how they target their audiences. So in the case of Scam, it's just 16 years old high school students, girls in Oslo. So it's very narrow. But this is the advantage actually, as opposed to globally circulating products, as far as I know. And also what you often need for an audience to build up is some kind of background, institutional background, perhaps. In the case of this Czech internet television, it's the search engine, which was actually established before Google came to the country, so it aged with its audiences. So its users are now mid-aged people who keep using the same services, the same email since the 90s. And that's also why these web series are directed in slightly older audiences, actually mid-age audiences. It's more mainstream than in the case of these teenager-directed web series. So these are just two observations.
It suggests that language is less important than we had assumed. All the theories suggest that language is crucially important.
Yeah, it's language and cultural affinity as well, kind of localized knowledge of you know, behind the stories, and also about the target audiences, not just language.
Okay, so we are done. Our time is up. So I would like to thank the audiences for the attention, questions, again to all the panelists for their inspirative talks, and to Ira for the response, and enjoy the rest of the conference.